The room in the orphanage was quiet. The children, having just finished their afternoon chores, sat in small groups, either playing with the few toys they had or reading the worn-out books provided by the institution. The orphanage, though well-meaning, had always felt cold, its walls bearing the weight of countless stories untold. But one particular boy, only 12 years old, stood apart from the others. His name was Oliver, and despite being small for his age, there was something about him that commanded attention. Perhaps it was his quiet determination or the unspoken air of mystery surrounding him. He had arrived at the orphanage when he was very young, and no one knew much about his past. His parents had died in a tragic accident, and he had been left alone with only the clothes on his back and a strange sense of longing in his eyes. It wasn't until one rainy afternoon, as the children gathered in the common room, that Oliver's story began to change. Oliver had always kept to himself, but today was different. He had something in his hands, something that had never been seen before at the orphanage. It was an envelope, old and weathered, but its contents were important. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles pale, as he slowly made his way to the front of the room, where the caretaker, Mrs. Thompson, was busy organizing some paperwork. The children, sensing the shift in the air, turned their attention to him. They had never seen Oliver so serious, so intent on something. His eyes darted from one face to another as though gathering the courage to speak. He cleared his throat before speaking in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I found this," he said, holding up the letter for everyone to see. "It's from my real family." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. Mrs. Thompson, who had always been the authoritative figure in the orphanage, looked up sharply. "Oliver, where did you get that?" she asked, her tone betraying a mixture of concern and disbelief. Oliver held the letter tighter. "It was hidden in my things," he explained. "I didn't know it was there, but I found it today." The other children gathered closer, their curiosity piqued. Some of them whispered excitedly among themselves, others simply stared at the letter, as if it held the key to some great mystery. With trembling hands, Oliver opened the letter. He unfolded the yellowing paper carefully, as though it might disintegrate in his grasp. The words, written in elegant script, were as follows. "Dear Oliver, if you are reading this, it means that the time has come for you to know the truth. You are not like the others at the orphanage. You have a special destiny, one that will change your life and the lives of those around you. You were not abandoned as you've been told. You were placed there for your own protection, and one day, you will understand why. Your true family has been waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth, but now it is time. You are destined for something greater than you can imagine. Trust in the path ahead, and know that you are loved. You will be contacted soon. With all our love, your family." Oliver stood frozen, holding the letter in his hands as the room fell into complete silence. The children were wide-eyed, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. Mrs. Thompson, however, looked as if she had been struck by lightning. Her face drained of color, and she took a step forward, her voice shaking. "Oliver, where did you find this?" she asked again, her eyes now fixed on him with a look that sent a shiver down his spine. "I told you," Oliver replied, his voice gaining strength. "I found it hidden in my things. It was sealed just like this. I don't know what it means, but it's from my family. I have a real family." The room erupted with whispers. Some of the children looked at each other with disbelief, while others exchanged excited glances. It was as if everything they had known about Oliver, the orphan who had never spoken about his past, was suddenly turned upside down. Mrs. Thompson's face tightened with concern. She had been the caretaker at the orphanage for years, and she knew something was wrong. There was a story behind this letter, and it wasn't one she had been told. She glanced at the letter in Oliver's hand again, her mind racing as she thought about the implications. "You shouldn't read things that don't belong to you, Oliver," she said sharply, trying to regain control of the situation. "That letter could be a mistake." "It could be." "It's not a mistake," Oliver interrupted, his voice rising with frustration. "It's real. I've been here my whole life, and no one's ever told me the truth. But now I know, I have a family out there. They're coming for me." For a moment, the room was filled with an uneasy tension. Mrs. Thompson remained silent, her face a mask of anxiety and uncertainty. She had never seen Oliver like this, and the sudden revelation shook her to the core. The truth of his origins had always been a mystery, one she had been content to leave buried. But now, that mystery had resurfaced, and it was clear that Oliver's past held secrets that no one, not even she, could have anticipated. The days that followed were tense. The children in the orphanage buzzed with speculation. What was Oliver's true identity? Why had he been kept in the dark for so long? And who was this mysterious family that had sent him the letter? Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson took it upon herself to investigate the matter further. She contacted the local authorities, the orphanage's governing board, and even reached out to distant relatives who might have knowledge of Oliver's background. But each inquiry returned empty-handed. There were no records, no leads, nothing to explain the letter or the family it spoke of. As the days turned into weeks, the mystery deepened. And for Oliver, each passing moment felt like an eternity. He waited anxiously for the promised contact, believing that the letter was his one true link to the family he had always longed for. But what happened next would take everyone by surprise, including Oliver himself. One fateful morning, a car pulled up to the orphanage gates. The children watched from the windows as a man in a dark suit and a woman wearing a coat of fine wool stepped out. They approached the orphanage, carrying an air of authority and a secret that would stun everyone, including Oliver. The door to the orphanage creaked open as the man and woman stepped inside. Their presence commanded attention, and the children watched with bated breath from the windows, whispering to one another. Something about them felt different, almost as if they belonged to a world far beyond the orphanage's dusty walls. Oliver, who had been sitting in the common room, holding the letter tightly in his hands, stood up the moment he saw them. His heart raced. He had no idea who these people were, but the letter had promised that his family would come. And now here they were. The man, tall and imposing, exchanged a brief glance with the woman before he walked directly toward Mrs. Thompson, who was standing by the front desk, her face ashen with worry. "Mrs. Thompson, I presume?" the man asked, his voice deep but polite. Yes, I'm Mrs. Thompson," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "How can I help you?" "We've come for Oliver," the woman said gently, her eyes soft but filled with an undeniable purpose. "He's been waiting for us." The words hung in the air, like a spark waiting to ignite a fire. Mrs. Thompson's expression faltered for just a moment before she regained composure. "Oliver?" she asked, though she already knew. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The man stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Mrs. Thompson's. "We are his family. We've come to bring him home." The children, who had been watching from the doorway, gasped in unison. Oliver stepped forward, his hands shaking as he clutched the letter tightly. His breath caught in his throat as he looked at the two strangers standing before him. His heart leapt, a mixture of hope and disbelief swirling inside him. "Are you really my family?" Oliver asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he feared the answer. He couldn't bring himself to believe it, couldn't bring himself to believe that this moment, this life-changing revelation, was finally happening. The woman smiled, her face softening as she knelt to his level. "Yes, Oliver. We've been looking for you for a very long time. You are our son." Oliver's eyes filled with tears, but he blinked them back, unwilling to let his emotions get the best of him. He had been alone for so long. Would this be real? Could this be real? His mind raced, but deep down, a feeling of connection, of home, began to take root in his heart. Mrs. Thompson stood frozen, still processing the shock of the moment. She had never imagined that Oliver's true family would come for him so suddenly, let alone in such an unexpected manner. She had tried to shield the children from the unknown, from the complexities of their pasts, but now, it seemed the truth had finally come to light. "Who? You're telling me that you're his family?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice rising in disbelief. "But I've never heard of you before. Why didn't we know about you?" The man's expression hardened slightly, though there was no malice in his voice. "For reasons that were beyond our control, Oliver was kept in the dark. But now that we've found him, we intend to take him home. He belongs with us, not here." A silence fell over the room, the weight of his words settling over everyone. The children watched, wide-eyed, their lives suddenly overshadowed by the revelation. They had grown used to the idea of being orphans, of not belonging anywhere. But Oliver? He was different. He had always been different. And now, the truth was unraveling in front of them. Oliver stood there, still holding the letter in his hands. I don't know what to do, he admitted, his voice quivering. This is too much. I've waited for so long to know who I am, but how do I leave everything behind? How do I leave the orphanage, leave my friends? The woman gently cupped Oliver's face in her hands, her touch warm and reassuring. You don't have to leave everything behind, dear. You'll always be a part of the place where you grew up. But now you have a family who loves you. You've always belonged with us. Oliver looked around at the other children, many of whom were staring at him with a mixture of awe and sorrow. He had been the one who had never spoken much about his past, the one who had kept his emotions hidden. But now, standing in front of these strangers, his family, he realized that his past was just one part of his story. The future was what mattered now. Thank you, Oliver said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never thought this day would come. Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat, her mind still spinning. I suppose there's no reason to keep you here if you have family to go to, she said quietly, a touch of sadness in her voice. But I'll never forget you, Oliver. You've been part of this orphanage longer than anyone can remember. Oliver nodded, his heart torn. He knew it wasn't the end of the world. It was just the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. But for all his excitement, a small part of him couldn't shake the feeling of loss. He had grown up in the orphanage, surrounded by children who had become his family, even if he didn't share their blood. The next few hours were a blur. Oliver packed his things, just a few clothes and small trinkets he had collected over the years. His new family was kind, patient, and understanding, but he could tell they were eager to take him away from the orphanage and into the life they had planned for him. The head of the orphanage, Mrs. Thompson, wished him well, but Oliver could see the sadness in her eyes as she spoke. Goodbye, Oliver, she said softly, her voice cracking slightly. I hope you find what you're looking for. I will, Oliver replied, his voice filled with both certainty and a lingering sadness. Thank you for everything. I'll never forget you. As the car drove away from the orphanage, Oliver looked back at the place that had been his home for as long as he could remember. It wasn't just a building. It was the place where he had learned who he was, even if he hadn't always known. But now, the letter in his hands was a symbol of the new life waiting for him, one filled with love, mystery, and the promise of a family that had always been there, even if he hadn't known it. And as the car sped off into the distance, Oliver felt something stir within him, a sense of belonging that he had never known before. The drive was long, and the world outside the car windows seemed to blur as they made their way to a place Oliver had never imagined, the life that had been waiting for him all these years. His new family, kind and gentle, tried their best to keep the conversation light, but Oliver could tell they were just as nervous as he was. They kept asking him questions about his life at the orphanage, about the friends he'd made, the things he had enjoyed. But Oliver, still unsure of what to say, kept most of his answers brief. He had so many questions of his own. The biggest one, of course, was why had he been kept in the dark for so long? Why had his family not come for him sooner? The letter had said they were waiting for the right moment, but that explanation felt too vague. It didn't feel real. The woman, who had introduced herself as Emily, glanced at Oliver through the rearview mirror. I know this is a lot to take in, she said gently, but we want you to know that you're safe now. You've always been a part of our family, even if we couldn't be with you before. We'll make sure you understand everything in time. Oliver nodded, though his thoughts were clouded. He had spent years dreaming of a family, but now that it was happening, it felt overwhelming. The excitement of the letter was still fresh in his mind, but the reality of leaving behind everything he had known, the orphanage, the friends, even the uncertainty, was heavier than he had anticipated. They arrived at their destination as the sun began to set, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink. The house was beautiful, standing tall at the end of a long driveway, nestled among trees that seemed to whisper in the wind. It was the kind of house Oliver had never imagined for himself, too grand, too perfect. It felt like a place out of a storybook. As they stepped inside, Oliver's breath caught in his throat. The The house was cozy and inviting, yet somehow still immaculate, with polished floors, elegant furniture, and soft, warm lighting that gave the whole place an air of comfort. It felt like a home. His home. Emily led him through the halls, showing him the various rooms. "This will be your room," she said, opening the door to a spacious, beautifully decorated bedroom. A bed with soft linens, a desk stacked with books, and a small window with a view of the garden. It was everything he could have hoped for, more than he could have imagined. Oliver stepped into the room, his eyes wide as he took it all in. This was his new life, his new reality. It felt unreal. That evening, they sat down to dinner as a family for the first time. Oliver, still adjusting to the whirlwind of emotions, was quiet, but Emily and her husband, Richard, made an effort to engage him in conversation. They asked about his favorite foods, his interests, and what he had been like as a child. But as the evening went on, it became clear that there were still many things left unsaid. The air felt heavy with unspoken words, the lingering question of why Oliver had been kept in the dark about his family's existence. After dinner, Richard stood up and smiled at Oliver. "How about we go for a walk in the garden? It's a clear night, and I think you'd enjoy it." Oliver, grateful for the distraction, nodded silently. As they stepped outside, the cool evening air kissed his skin, and the stars above seemed to stretch on forever. The garden was beautiful, a serene space with blooming flowers, winding paths, and a small fountain in the center. They walked in silence for a few minutes before Richard spoke up. "I know this is a lot for you," Richard said softly, "and I know it might feel strange being here. But we want you to understand that everything we've done for you, for your safety, for your future. There's a lot about our family's history that we need to explain, but we want you to feel ready to hear it when the time comes." Oliver nodded slowly, but a flood of questions surged within him. He wanted answers, answers to the questions that had been burning inside him ever since he had read the letter. Why had they kept him away for so long? What was so dangerous that they had to hide him in the orphanage? Who were they really? What did he mean by family's history? "I don't understand," Oliver said quietly, stopping in his tracks and turning to face Richard. "I've always wondered where I came from, why I was alone. But this feels so different. Why didn't you come sooner? Why didn't you take me home when I was younger?" Richard took a deep breath, his gaze soft but filled with something Oliver couldn't quite place. "We couldn't, Oliver. We had to protect you. There were things happening that were beyond our control. Things we didn't want you to be a part of. You were safer where you were, even though it may not have felt that way." Oliver looked at him, trying to process the words, but they only seemed to raise more questions. "Protect me from what?" Richard's face darkened, and he looked away, as if trying to find the right words. "There are things in our past, things we haven't been able to share yet. But I promise you, when the time is right, you'll understand. For now, all you need to know is that you are safe and you are home. That's all that matters." Oliver stared at him, 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. There was something in Richard's tone, something he couldn't quite pinpoint, that made him uneasy. He had been given a family, a home, and the promise of a future. But the shadows of the past lingered, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the answers he sought were not as simple as they seemed. As they walked back toward the house, Oliver could feel the weight of the unknown settling over him. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he was no longer just an orphan. He was a part of something much bigger, something filled with secrets, mysteries, and untold truths. And whether he was ready or not, the next chapter of his life was about to unfold. The days that followed were a blur of new experiences for Oliver. His new home, though welcoming, still felt foreign to him. Everything was so different: his room, the food, the people. Emily and Richard were kind and patient, but Oliver couldn't shake the feeling that there were things they weren't telling him. The promise of answers loomed over him, but every conversation seemed to skirt around the truth, as though they were preparing him for something he wasn't quite ready to understand. One evening after dinner, Oliver sat alone in his room, staring out the window. The moonlight spilled across the garden, and the sound of crickets chirping outside was a soft reminder of the world that existed beyond the walls of his new life. His fingers traced the edges of the letter he had received, the one that had set all this into motion. He wondered how much of it had been true, how much had been hidden from him. The words, "You were placed there for your own protection," echoed in his mind. But from what? What? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Oliver?" It was Emily's voice. "Can I come in?" Oliver quickly tucked the letter beneath his pillow and turned toward the door. "Yes, sure," he replied. Emily stepped inside, her presence gentle and comforting. She smiled warmly at him, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I thought we could sit outside for a while, if you're up for it," she suggested. "Get some fresh air, talk a bit?" Oliver nodded. He needed to clear his head, and perhaps this would be a chance to finally get some answers. They walked through the garden in silence, the cool night air brushing against their faces. Emily led him to a bench by the fountain, where they sat down together. The sound of water trickling from the fountain filled the space between them. "You've been so quiet lately, Oliver," Emily began softly. "I know this is a lot for you to take in, and I understand if you're feeling overwhelmed. But I want you to know something. You're not alone anymore. You have a family now, and we love you." Oliver nodded, his fingers fidgeting with the sleeve of his jacket. "I know," he said quietly, "but there's a lot I don't understand. And I need to know the truth. You said I'd understand everything when the time was right, but I don't feel ready." Emily sighed, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "I know it's hard, and I've been trying to figure out the best way to explain everything to you. But the truth is complicated, Oliver. Our family has been through things that were dangerous. And for your safety, we kept you away from all of it." Oliver's heart raced as he looked at her. "What kind of things? What's so dangerous that I had to be kept in the dark for all these years?" Emily's face grew more serious, and she hesitated as though searching for the right words. "There are people in our family, people who are connected to dangerous things. Powerful people who would do anything to get what they want. And when you were born, we made a choice to protect you. We sent you to the orphanage because it was the safest place for you. But that doesn't mean we forgot about you, or that we didn't want to bring you home. It was simply too risky." Oliver's mind spun. "So, I've been hiding my whole life? From people in our own family?" Emily nodded. "Yes. But now things have changed. We've managed to remove you from that danger, and we believe it's time for you to know who you really are. But there's more to your story, things you won't fully understand until you're ready." Oliver clenched his fists in his lap, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He had always known there was something about his past that didn't quite add up, but hearing it out loud made it all feel too real. "I don't understand though," he said, his voice shaking. "Why didn't you just come for me sooner? Why wait until now? And what am I supposed to do with this knowledge?" Emily's voice softened, and she placed a hand on his. "We wanted to protect you from the truth until we knew it was safe. But now, Oliver, you are a part of something bigger. You are part of our legacy, our family's history. And there are people out there who will stop at nothing to control that. But you don't have to face it alone. We're here to help you, to guide you through this." The next few days were filled with tension. Oliver couldn't stop thinking about what Emily had told him. His past, his family, everything he thought he knew had been turned upside down. And still, there was so much more to uncover. Why was he so important? What was his family's legacy, and why were there people who wanted to control it? One afternoon, as he was pacing in his room, Oliver heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find Richard standing there, his expression serious. "Oliver," Richard began, his voice low, "we need to talk. It's time you knew more. There are things you need to understand before it's too late." Oliver's heart skipped a beat. The words, "before it's too late," sent a shiver down his spine. What did they mean? What was about to happen? Richard motioned for him to follow, and together they walked down a narrow hallway that led to a private study at the back of the house. The room was dimly lit, filled with shelves of old books and documents. At the center of the room was a large desk, on which several papers were neatly arranged. Richard gestured for Oliver to sit. "This is where everything started," he said. "The truth about your family, about our past, it's all here." Oliver sat down, his mind racing with anticipation. "What do you mean? What truth?" Richard looked at him with a mixture of concern and resolve. The truth about who you are and what your family's legacy means for the future. And why you were hidden away all these years. Oliver's pulse quickened. This was it. The answers were finally within his reach. Richard slowly unrolled a map, old and faded, across the desk. This is a map of our family's holdings, he said, pointing to various locations. It's not just land or money. It's power that's been passed down through generations. Oliver leaned forward, intrigued but confused. Power? What kind of power? Richard hesitated before speaking. The kind of power that comes with knowledge. Knowledge of things that people would kill to control. But we've kept it hidden, kept it safe. Until now. Oliver's eyes widened as he tried to absorb the enormity of what Richard was saying. What do you want me to do with all of this? Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. I want you to understand, Oliver. The time has come for you to take your place in this legacy. There are people who will stop at nothing to control what you've inherited. And you're the only one who can stop them. Oliver stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of everything, his past, his family, the secrets, was overwhelming. But in that moment he knew one thing for certain. The life he had known was over, and the journey ahead would be unlike anything he had ever imagined. The weight of Richard's words hung in the air, suffocating Oliver as he tried to process everything that had been revealed to him. His family, the legacy, the power, it was all too much, too soon. But something deep within him stirred. He had spent so many years wondering who he really was, why he was different from the other children in the orphanage. And now, finally, he was starting to understand. Richard's voice broke the silence, steady and calm but filled with urgency. Oliver, I know this is a lot to take in, but you have to understand, what you've inherited isn't just wealth or status. It's knowledge, something far more valuable. Your family has guarded it for generations, and now, it's your turn to protect it. Oliver shook his head, still not fully grasping what was being asked of him. What do you mean by protect it? What am I supposed to do with all of this? Richard stepped closer, his expression grave. There are groups, dangerous groups, who would do anything to get their hands on what your family knows. They've been looking for the key to unlock that power for years. And now that you're old enough, you're the one they'll target? Oliver felt his heart race at the mention of dangerous groups. He had always known that something in his life had been kept from him, but now, it seemed like everything was part of a much larger picture, one filled with peril and intrigue. Who are these people? Oliver asked, his voice trembling. Why are they after me? Richard's gaze hardened, his eyes reflecting the seriousness of the situation. We don't know exactly who they are yet, but they've been hunting your family for years. They want to use the knowledge passed down through generations to gain control of power, real power, the kind that can change the course of history. Oliver stared at the papers on the desk, the map, the old documents, all pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite understand. But why didn't you tell me this before? Why keep me in the dark all these years? Emily, who had quietly entered the room, stepped forward, her face full of regret. We wanted to protect you, Oliver. We didn't want to put you in danger. Your safety was our priority. We thought you were safe in the orphanage, away from everything that could harm you. Oliver's mind spun. So, you knew all along that people were after me? That my family was important? Yes, Richard said softly, but we kept you hidden for your own good. We had to wait until the time was right. Until you were old enough to understand the responsibility you now carry. But now that you know, we need you to prepare for what's coming. The days that followed were filled with a sense of urgency. Oliver's new life, which had seemed so perfect, had quickly been overshadowed by the realization that danger was lurking around every corner. Richard and Emily did their best to explain the intricacies of the family's legacy, teaching Oliver about the history that had been hidden from him for so long. They showed him ancient texts, cryptic symbols, and maps that traced their lineage back centuries. As the knowledge sank in, Oliver felt both empowered and terrified. He was a part of something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The power his family had guarded for so long was now his to protect, and he knew that the responsibility weighed heavily on him. But there was one thing Oliver couldn't shake, the feeling that someone was already watching him. It was as if the moment he learned the truth, he had become a target. And the more he learned about his family's history, the more it became clear that the path ahead wouldn't be an easy one. One night, as Oliver sat in his room, trying to make sense of the flood of information he had been given, he heard a noise outside his window. It was a soft rustling sound, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't seen anyone outside since he'd arrived, and the house felt far too quiet. He moved cautiously toward the window, peering out into the darkness. The moonlight bathed the garden in an eerie glow, casting long shadows across the lawn. Everything seemed still, but Oliver couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. Just as he was about to turn away, something caught his eye, a figure, cloaked in darkness, moving swiftly through the garden. The figure paused for a moment, and Oliver's breath caught in his throat. It was watching him. The next morning, Oliver went straight to Richard and Emily, his mind racing. He didn't want to alarm them, but he couldn't ignore what he had seen. "I saw someone last night," he said, his voice shaky. "In the garden. A person. They were watching my window." Richard's face immediately darkened, and Emily looked alarmed. "What time was this?" Richard asked, his tone sharp. "It was late, around midnight. They were moving through the garden, and they stopped for a moment. I'm sure they saw me." Emily stepped forward, her expression serious. "This changes things," she said quietly. "We knew this day would come, but we didn't expect it to happen so soon." "They're here, Richard?" Richard nodded grimly. "We have to act fast. They found us. But we're not going to let them take you, Oliver." That night, as the house settled into an uneasy calm, Oliver sat with his new family in the study. They were making preparations, organizing everything they had learned, and setting a plan into motion. The stakes had never been higher. Oliver wasn't just an ordinary boy anymore. He was the key to something bigger than any of them could have imagined. Richard handed Oliver a small, intricately carved box. "This is the first step," he said. "Inside this box are the answers you need. The key to your family's legacy. But be careful. You're not the only one looking for it." Oliver's hands trembled as he took the box. It was heavier than it seemed, and the weight of it felt more than just physical. It was as if it carried the weight of generations of secrets and promises unfulfilled. "Whatever happens," Richard continued, his voice steady but urgent, "you must protect this. You are the only one who can." Oliver nodded, determined but anxious. He knew his life had just changed forever. What had once been a quiet, uncertain existence had now been replaced with a future full of questions, danger, and the promise of something much greater than himself. And as he held the box in his hands, he realized that the time for answers had finally come. But whether he was ready for what lay ahead, only time would tell. The weight of the small carved box in Oliver's hands felt heavier than he could ever have imagined. It wasn't just the physical weight, it was the sense of responsibility that came with it. His whole life had been turned upside down, and now he held the key to a legacy that was more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Richard and Emily watched him closely, their expressions filled with both concern and pride. They had always known that this day would come, that the moment would arrive when Oliver would be thrust into the heart of their family's mystery. But even they hadn't expected it to happen so soon. "We'll protect you, Oliver," Emily said softly, her voice reassuring but tinged with fear. "But you have to understand, we can't do this alone. We need to stay ahead of them. They'll stop at nothing to get their hands on what's in that box." Oliver nodded, his fingers brushing over the intricate carvings. "What's inside it? What does it all mean?" Richard stood up and began pacing the room, his mind clearly working through the details. Inside the box are symbols that trace the origin of our family's power. They lead to an ancient location hidden away for centuries. But it's not just the knowledge that's dangerous, it's the people who seek it. They want control of the secrets inside, the same secrets your family has protected for generations. Oliver's heart raced as the weight of his situation became clear. He wasn't just running from a distant past, he was now running from the future, a future that had already been set in motion, one full of danger and intrigue. "And who are these people?" Oliver asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do they want this power so badly?" Emily sat down next to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. They are a shadowy organization, one that has been operating for centuries, pulling strings from the darkness. We don't know much about them, only that they've been after your family's legacy for as long as we can remember. They believe that whoever controls the knowledge in that box can change the world, or destroy it. Oliver's mind was spinning. The idea that his family, his very bloodline, was tied to something so powerful, so dangerous, was overwhelming. But it also made him realize something else. He was no longer just a boy from the orphanage. He was part of something bigger, something with a purpose he could barely comprehend. How do we stop them? Oliver asked, determination rising in his chest. What do I need to do? Richard looked at him, his face serious. We need to keep moving. We can't stay here. If they know we have the box, they'll come for us. And we need to figure out what the symbols mean, how to unlock the full meaning behind them. That's our first step. Find the answers before they do. Emily nodded. We'll have to move quickly. And we'll need help. There are others who might be able to assist us, people who know about the legacy but have kept their distance for years. It's time to call on them. That night, after a quick dinner, the three of them began packing, preparing to leave the safety of their new home behind. Emily and Richard had a hidden safe house, a place deep in the countryside, where they could regroup and plan their next steps without the threat of immediate danger. But it wasn't just the location they were concerned about, it was the people who might be following them, watching their every move. Oliver couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had already been upended by forces beyond their control, and now they were just trying to stay one step ahead. He clutched the box tightly as they made their way to the car, his thoughts racing. He wasn't just a child anymore. He was the key to something much larger, and the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The next morning, they were on the road, leaving the house behind, heading toward the safe house. The journey felt strangely peaceful at first, but Oliver knew that peace was fleeting. He couldn't help but feel that at any moment, someone would appear out of the shadows, ready to take what was rightfully his. The feeling of being hunted was new to him, and it made his heart race with fear, but also with resolve. He had to learn how to protect what was his, and it all started with the box. As they drove, Emily broke the silence. There are people we can trust, she said quietly. People who know about the legacy, who can help us decipher the symbols. But we'll have to move quickly. If they catch wind of where we're headed, it could be too late. Richard added, we've been too complacent for too long. It's time to stop running from the truth and face it head-on. They arrived at the safe house as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the small, secluded cottage. The house was hidden in the middle of dense woods, far away from any prying eyes. Oliver could feel the tension lift slightly as they entered the house and settled in. This is where we regroup, Richard said. We have a few people we can reach out to. But before we do anything, we need to focus on the symbols in the box. It's the key to everything. Once we understand it, we'll know our next move. Oliver sat at the table as Richard opened the box and laid out the contents. Inside, there were several small pieces of parchment, each one covered in ancient symbols that Oliver had never seen before. The symbols seemed to dance on the paper, their meaning elusive, but somehow familiar. These are the symbols of our family's legacy, Richard explained. They represent different aspects of our power, of our knowledge. Each one leads to a location, a place where part of the legacy is hidden. Emily looked over his shoulder, pointing at one of the symbols. This one, she said, her voice trembling. It's from the northern mountains. It's where our ancestors hid the most dangerous part of the legacy. Oliver's eyes widened as he looked at the symbols, trying to piece together the puzzle. So we have to go there? Richard nodded grimly. Yes. But it won't be easy. The people after us know about that place. And they're not the only ones who are looking for it. As they prepared to leave for the mountains, the weight of the journey ahead grew heavier. The box and the symbols were more than just a map. They were a beacon, calling them into a future filled with danger, secrets, and a legacy Oliver wasn't sure he was ready to bear. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to run from it anymore. The time for answers had come, and Oliver was ready to face whatever lay ahead, no matter how dangerous or uncertain it was. The journey to the northern mountains was long and arduous. The landscape changed as they drove further from civilization, the roads becoming more treacherous, winding through dense forests and rocky hills. Oliver sat in the back of the car, his hands still clutching the box, its weight a constant reminder of the legacy he was now carrying. The symbols inside it seemed to pulse with an energy he could almost feel, as if they were calling out to him, urging him to uncover their secrets. Every moment felt like a countdown. They were closer than ever to the truth, but Oliver knew that with each passing mile, the danger was growing. He couldn't help but glance nervously over his shoulder, feeling the ever-present sense of being hunted. As night began to fall, they stopped at a small inn on the edge of a village, the last stop before the final leg of their journey. The air was cold, and the inn was humble. Its walls creaked under the weight of the years, but it felt like a safe haven for the time being. "We need to rest," Richard said, his voice calm, but the weariness in his eyes betraying the toll of their travels. "We've made good progress today, but we'll need to move quickly tomorrow. The location we're heading to is just beyond the mountains, and we'll need to make sure we're prepared." Emily nodded, but her face was drawn with concern. "I don't like this. The more we get closer, the more I feel like we're being watched." Oliver, who had been silent for most of the day, looked up at them. "Do you think they know we're coming? Do you think they're waiting for us?" Richard met his gaze. "They always know. That's the danger of this legacy. But we've always managed to stay one step ahead. Tomorrow we will face whatever comes and we'll protect you." The words did little to calm Oliver's nerves. The weight of the box seemed heavier than ever as he lay down on the bed that night, the quiet murmur of the wind outside mixing with his racing thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would change everything. The next morning, they set off early, the mist of the mountains rising around them like a shroud. The path they followed became more difficult to navigate, the terrain growing steeper, the air thinner. Richard and Emily kept a careful pace, but Oliver found himself struggling to keep up. Not just physically, but mentally. He was no longer just a boy from the orphanage. He was now a part of something much larger, a legacy that could determine the fate of the world. They reached the foot of the mountain just as the sun began to rise, casting a soft golden light on the peaks ahead. A sense of finality washed over Oliver. They were close, so close to uncovering the truth, but what would they find when they got there? "This is it," Richard said, looking up at the towering cliffs that loomed ahead. "The hidden chamber is at the summit. It's been kept secret for centuries, guarded by those who knew the truth about the legacy. But we can't afford to waste any time. The longer we wait, the closer they'll get." The climb was grueling. As they ascended, the air grew colder, and the path grew narrower. The wind howled through the mountain passes, making every step feel like a battle. But Oliver didn't stop. With each step, the weight of the box in his hands seemed lighter, as if he was being carried forward by the power of the legacy it contained. It was as if the symbols were speaking to him now, urging him to keep going. Hours later, they reached the summit, a small, secluded plateau surrounded by jagged rocks. In the center of the plateau stood an ancient stone structure, half hidden by moss and time, but unmistakably carved with the same symbols Oliver had seen in the box. "This is it," Richard said, his voice tight with anticipation. "The chamber where the legacy is hidden." Oliver approached the entrance, his heart pounding in his chest. As he stepped closer, the symbols on the stone door seemed to glow faintly, as though reacting to the box in his hands. He placed the box on a nearby pedestal, carefully opening it to reveal the ancient parchment inside. With shaking hands, he took the parchment and held it up to the stone door. The symbols matched perfectly. "This is the key," Richard said, his voice reverberating with awe. "Only the rightful heir can unlock it. And that's you, Oliver. You've always been the key." Oliver stepped forward, the parchment in his hands trembling. He pressed it against the door, and as if by magic, the symbols began to shift and rearrange. The door creaked, and with a rumble that echoed through the mountain, it slowly began to open. What lay beyond the door was nothing like Oliver had ever imagined. The chamber was vast, the ceiling high and vaulted, the walls covered in carvings and strange, glowing symbols. At the center of the room stood an altar, its surface covered in dust, but still emanating a faint energy that Oliver could feel deep within him. The air was thick with the weight of history, as though the very room was alive with the secrets it held. Richard and Emily stepped forward, their faces filled with awe and reverence. "This is it, Oliver," Richard whispered. "The heart of the legacy. The knowledge that has been passed down through generations. But be careful. There's more to it than just power. What you do here will determine everything." Oliver nodded, his heart racing. He approached the altar, the symbols from the parchment now glowing brighter than ever. The power in the room was undeniable, and for a moment, Oliver felt like he could do anything. The weight of the responsibility, however, quickly settled back into his chest. He placed the parchment on the altar, and as soon as he did, the symbols began to glow with an intensity that lit up the entire room. The air grew heavy, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble. "Oliver," Emily called, her voice sharp with concern. "Something's happening." But it was too late. The ground shook violently, and suddenly, a dark figure appeared at the entrance of the chamber, cloaked in shadows. "You should have stayed hidden, boy," the figure's voice growled, filled with malice. "The legacy belongs to us, not to you." Oliver stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew who this person was. It was the leader of the organization that had been hunting his family for centuries. The one who had finally found them. "Stay away from him," Richard shouted, stepping in front of Oliver. But the figure was already moving, faster than anyone could react.